They were told they would be stripped, punished, paraded. Instead, they were told to line up and handed dresses. October 1945. The boots of the guards thudded softly against dry Texas soil as the sun climbed higher. 23 Japanese women stood barefoot in the dust, their eyes hollow, their uniforms torn. They had once been part of Japan's brutal military infrastructure, forced into roles as so-called comfort girls, now prisoners discarded by an empire that had lost its war. Of the 847 women classified as comfort unit personnel in the Pacific Theater, only 203 survived to see American soil. Of those 203, made it to Camp Livingston, Texas. 4 would die within the first month. This is what happened to the other 19. The line stood crooked in the heat. Some swayed on their feet from exhaustion. Others clenched fists behind their backs, prepared to fight even now, even here. A few simply stared at the ground, waiting for the inevitable. Mitsuko Tanaka, 20 years old, stood in the center of the line. Her hair hung in greasy strands around her face. Her cotton uniform, once white, had turned the color of old newspaper. In her pocket she carried half of a bamboo comb, the only thing her mother had given her before the recruiters came. The other half had broken off 2 years ago. She'd kept both pieces anyway. She did not look at the cowboys standing 20 feet away. She did not look at the barn behind them, or the wide Texas sky, or the cattle grazing in the distance. She looked at the dirt beneath her bare feet and prepared herself for what came next. Back in Japan, they had been warned of this exact scene. Line up, they'd been told, and prepare for degradation. The Americans would strip them, humiliate them, parade them for their own amusement. A Japanese officer 3 days before surrender had gathered the women in a cement room that smelled of mildew and diesel fuel. His voice had been flat, mechanical, like a man reading from a script he'd memorized long ago. "The Americans will not see you as human," he'd said. "They will photograph you naked. They will print those photographs in their newspapers. Your families will see. Your neighbors will see. You will become a symbol of Japan's shame." One girl had asked, her voice barely a whisper, "What should we do?" The officer had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd placed a small knife on the table between them. "Preserve your honor," he'd said, "while you still can." Mitsuko had not taken the knife, but she'd thought about it every day since. Now, standing in the Texas heat with 22 other women who had also refused the knife, she wondered if that had been a mistake. The shame of survival felt heavier than the shame of death. At least, death had finality. This, whatever this was, stretched out in front of her like an endless grey road with no horizon. A cowboy stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a sunburned neck and a clipboard in his hand. He did not shout. He did not raise his weapon. He simply walked past them, slowly, boots crunching against the gravel eyes, scanning each face with something that looked almost like uncertainty. Behind him, another man appeared, older, with dust on his boots and a sweat-stained hat pulled low over his eyes. He carried a wooden box in both hands. The women stiffened. This was it, they thought. This was where the breaking began. But then something strange happened. The man with the box stepped forward and held something out. Not a weapon, not chains. A folded piece of fabric, pale blue with small white flowers stitched along the hem. A dress. The woman he offered it to, a 24-year-old former schoolteacher named Chio, did not move. She stared at the dress like it might explode. The man didn't insist. He simply waited quiet, holding the cotton in both hands like an offering at a shrine. Another cowboy moved down the line, offering a similar bundle to the next girl, then another, then another. Cotton shifts, folded neatly, each with a bar of soap tucked inside. Some had small wooden combs. One had a handkerchief embroidered with a yellow daisy. No one moved at first. It was as if their limbs had forgotten how. Mitsuko watched as one girl no older than 16 reached out slowly, hand trembling, then snatched the bundle back like a thief, She clutched it to her chest, staring at the soap as if it were a lie made solid. Another woman, older, with grey streaks in her hair, fell to her knees and began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just soft tears that streaked through the dust on her cheeks. The cowboys said nothing. They didn't gawk, they didn't mock. One crouched down beside the crying woman and gently placed a comb on the ground next to her. Then he stood and walked away without a word. Somewhere behind the barn a horse stamped its hoof. The sky stretched open and cloudless above them. And still no one shouted, no one barked orders. The line remained wobbly, uneven, but intact. When the cowboy with the clipboard reached Mitsuko, he stopped. He held out a dress, light green, with tiny white buttons down the front. For a moment she didn't breathe. She looked at the dress, then at the man's face. His eyes were blue pale as winter sky. There was no cruelty in them, no hunger, just exhaustion, and something else she couldn't name. He said one word, "Mom." The word landed like a stone in still water. Mitsuko reached out. Her fingers brushed the cotton. It was soft, softer than anything she'd touched in 3 years. She took the dress, held it against her chest, and felt something inside her crack open just a little. Not relief, not gratitude, just confusion so deep it felt like drowning. The cowboy nodded once, tipped his hat, and moved on. In place of cruelty, there was only quiet routine. A hand extended, an offering made. Each woman was given the same: a dress, a comb, a bar of soap, a rag for washing. One girl received a toothbrush and stared at it like a puzzle. Another whispered something in Japanese too soft to hear and clutched her cotton bundle like it was a child. The shame they had prepared for didn't arrive. Instead came a discomfort far more disorienting. Dignity. Not all accepted it easily. Some still stood rigid, refusing to take the bundles, unsure whether it was a trick. A few turned their heads defiant even in captivity, but even they felt it that something was off. This wasn't how enemies behaved. The rules, the warnings, the fears, they didn't fit this moment. When the line finally dispersed, the women carried their new belongings to the barn in silence. No guards forced them, no guns pushed them forward. Some walked slowly, glancing down at the fabric in their hands as if it might disappear. Others clutched theirs tightly, unwilling to let go of the first softness they'd held in years. Mitsuko paused at the door of the barn and looked back at the cowboys still standing where they had handed out dresses. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Something was beginning to crack. Not loudly, not all at once, but like hairline fractures running across the foundation of everything she thought she knew. The Americans hadn't shouted. They hadn't humiliated them. They had made them line up and then treated them like people. Inside the barn, the air was dry and heavy with the scent of hay, leather, and dust. Sunlight streamed through the slats in the walls, drawing golden lines across the floor. A few horses snorted quietly in the stalls beyond, shifting in place. No shouting, no barking orders, no eyes that lingered too long. Just space, just quiet. Against the far wall were rows of cots, real ones, not straw mats or floors or sheets of tin. Actual beds with frames and folded blankets. Some had pillows. Fumiko, a 19-year-old orphan who stood barely over 5 feet tall, froze beside hers, staring like it might vanish. Another woman reached out and touched the corner of her blanket, then quickly pulled her hand back. It was soft. That scared her more than if it had been rough. When the guards left and the door shut behind them, they just stood there for a while. The barn wasn't locked. No chains, no bars on the windows. A few sat down. One laid back, slowly testing the mattress beneath her with careful weight. When it didn't snap or disappear, she let her body sink into it and stared up at the wooden ceiling. Her name was Saruko. She was 28 years old. She had not been truly horizontal in months. Her bones ached, not from pain, but from confusion. Night fell quietly. Outside, the crickets began their chorus. Somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played a slow, aimless tune. Tsuruko lay awake listening. Not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't. Her eyes followed the beams above her, tracing the dust floating through moonlight. There were no screams, no engines, no commands, only the sound of cows breathing and the faint clink of metal from the far end of the barn. Then the door opened again. A cowboy stepped in, hat in hand. He didn't come close. He just approached the stove near the center of the barn, crouched down and stirred something in a battered pot. The smell came first. Onions, beef, something that made the air suddenly feel heavier. Hunger twisted inside every stomach in that room. The man ladled stew into tin cups, placed them gently onto a wooden tray, and left it by the barn door. Then he walked out without a word. Mitsuko didn't move at first. No one did. But then Chio stood. She approached the tray, slowly knelt beside it like it was a shrine, and picked up a cup. She brought it back to her cot, both hands wrapped around it like it was fire. Others followed. The first sip was almost painful. The salt stung their tongues. The oil clung to their lips. The warmth filled their chests like smoke. Mitsuko drank and felt tears press behind her eyes, not from the taste, but from the memory. She remembered rice. She remembered miso. She remembered what it felt like to eat without shame. And now, here fed by the hands of the enemy, she felt shame all over again, because this kindness was unbearable. Later, when the cups were empty and the barn had gone still again, a medic entered. He said nothing, just walked down the row of cots with a basket of bandages and a tin box of ointment. He didn't touch them without asking. He motioned, waited, knelt. A few girls flinched when he got too close, but he didn't react. He unwrapped old wounds, applied fresh gauze, checked for fever. When he came to Mitsuko, he paused. Her ankle was swollen from the march weeks ago. She nodded barely. He knelt. His hands were calloused but gentle. When he finished wrapping it, he stood, nodded once, and walked away. On her pillow was a folded cloth. Inside it, a bar of soap, white, unscented, clean. She held it in her hand long after the lights dimmed, not because she needed to wash, but because it was the first thing she'd been given that didn't come with a demand. No trade, no cost. It was just given, and that somehow made it the hardest thing of all. The next morning began with a knock. Not a shout, not a bang, just 3 calm taps against the barn door, followed by a pause. Then the door eased open and a young cowboy stepped through. His name was Levi. He was 19 years old, with sunburned cheeks and a clipboard in his hand. He cleared his throat and said a single word in broken Japanese. Breakfast. The smell hit them before they saw the food. Not rice, not miso. The scent of meat frying in its own fat eggs, cracking into hot oil bread, toasting over flame. It was foreign. It was overwhelming. It was bacon. Levi carried in a tray and set it on the long wooden table near the stove. Then he stepped back, nodded, and left. On the tray, strips of bacon edges, crispy and dark fat, still glistening. Fried eggs with yolks bright as summer sun. Thick slices of bread, toasted golden, smeared with butter that melted into every pore. A pot of coffee, black and bitter steam curling into the cool morning air. Mitsuko stared at the bacon like it was gold. She picked up a single strip. It was still warm. The edges crackled under her fingers. She brought it to her mouth and bit down. The fat melted on her tongue. Salt exploded across her taste buds. Sweetness followed the kind that comes from meat cooked low and slow until the sugars caramelize. The crispy edge crunched between her teeth, and for a moment, just a moment, she wasn't in a barn in Texas. She was at a table in Yokohama. Her mother was across from her, smiling, passing her a bowl of rice with a piece of grilled pork on top. Then the memory vanished, and she was back, alone, holding a piece of enemy bacon in her hand. Tears ran down her face. Chio ate slowly, cutting each piece into smaller and smaller bites as if she could make the meal last forever. Fumiko wrapped a strip of bacon in a napkin and tucked it into her pocket. For later, just in case. It was a habit born from years of starvation. Even now, even here, she couldn't break it. Noriko, the 22-year-old who had once trained as a nurse, didn't touch the food. She just sat and stared at the plate in front of her, hands folded in her lap, eyes distant. Tsuruko ate everything. Then she cried. Not because it tasted good, but because it reminded her of a life she'd forgotten existed. A life where food was just food, not survival, not shame, just nourishment. When Levi returned an hour later to collect the trays, he saw Noriko's plate untouched. He paused. Then he took a smaller plate, placed a single piece of toast on it, and set it beside her without a word. He didn't wait for her to respond. He just picked up the trays and left. 5 minutes later, Noriko picked up the toast. She took a small bite from the corner, then another. Then she finished it. That afternoon, the cowboy with the clipboard, the one who had handed out the dresses, appeared again. His name, they would later learn, was Caleb Bridger. He was 32 years old. He had a brother named Daniel who died at Iwo Jima 7 months earlier. Daniel's last letter home, still folded in Caleb's pocket, said, "I killed 3 men today. I don't feel proud. I just feel tired." Caleb looked at the 23 women sitting in the barn and saw his brother's face in every enemy soldier he'd ever imagined. But these weren't soldiers. They were women. Broken women. Leftovers of a war that had ended but refused to let go. He cleared his throat and spoke in slow, careful English. "We got a doctor. He's gonna check you for injuries. You don't gotta do nothing you don't want. But if you're hurt, he can help." Mitsuko translated quietly for those who didn't understand. The words hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight. One by one they were led to a small room beside the barn. Inside it smelled like alcohol and gauze. The light was softer, filtered through high windows. A row of cots had been set up, and near them stood Dr. Ellis Warren, a 58-year-old man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that had stitched up more wounds than he cared to count. He gestured, gently motioning for them to sit. Mitsuko perched on the edge of a cot, heart pounding. Her eyes darted around, scanning for exits, for weapons, for threats. But none came. Dr. Warren approached, gloves already on, and knelt beside her. He didn't touch her at first, just looked at her ankle, the one that had been wrapped the night before, and made a soft, thoughtful sound. Then he nodded once, unwrapped the bandage, and began to work. His hands were steady, practiced. When he pressed against the swelling, he didn't squeeze. He cradled it like something delicate. He asked questions in English, though she didn't understand them. Still, his tone was calm. No mocking, no grabbing, no smirking, just care. Another girl flinched when Dr. Warren approached her with a stethoscope. She covered her chest with both arms trembling. The doctor froze. Then slowly he knelt down and placed the stethoscope against his own heart. He tapped it twice and smiled. She didn't smile back, but she let him listen. When the examinations were done, the women returned to the barn in silence. No one spoke, but something had shifted. Not trust? Not yet. But the first fragile thread of it, thin as spider silk, had been spun. That night, Mitsuko lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling. In her hand she held the bar of soap the medic had left. She turned it over and over, feeling its weight, its smoothness. It smelled faintly of lavender. She thought about the bacon, the dress, the doctor's gentle hands. The cowboy who had said "Mom" like she was a person and not a thing. None of it made sense. The propaganda had been clear. The Americans were monsters. They would strip, humiliate, destroy. But instead they had given her a dress. They had fed her bacon. They had wrapped her wounds. It was more terrifying than any torture. Because if the propaganda was wrong about this, what else had it been wrong about? And if the enemy could be kind, what did that make her? What did that make everything she'd survived? She closed her eyes and whispered a question into the dark. "What are you doing to us?" No one answered. But outside the harmonica played on, slow, peaceful, like a lullaby for the lost. The paper was thin, off-white, and folded crisply in half. A pencil, dulled at the tip, was placed beside it on the cot. Caleb Bridger, the cowboy who had handed out the dresses, walked through the barn distributing them one by one. He didn't explain much, just said the word letter in English, then added in broken Japanese, home, you, right. Then he smiled, brief and uncertain, and walked on. The barn grew quiet. Too quiet. 23 women stared at their blank pages, and no one moved. Mitsuko held the pencil like it might splinter between her fingers. She had not written a letter in over 2 years. Even before her capture mail had been censored, filtered, reduced to empty platitudes meant to reassure parents while hiding the truth. But now, what could she even say? That she was still breathing, that she had not been beaten in weeks, that the Cowboys said "Mom" and tipped their hats, that her meals came on plates not scattered on the ground like feed for animals across the barn. Chio wrote slowly, deliberately. Her hand moved across the page with the precision of someone who had once taught children how to form their characters neatly. But after 4 sentences, she stopped. The pencil hovered over the paper, trembling. Then she set it down. Fumiko didn't write at all. She just held the paper up to the light streaming through the barn slats, watching the way it glowed, translucent gold. She'd never owned clean paper before. It seemed too valuable to waste on words she didn't know how to spell. Noriko, the former nurse with the scar across her wrist, wrote only 4 words. Then she folded the paper and pressed it flat with both palms, as if sealing a prayer. Later, when Mitsuko glanced at the discarded first draft in the trash, she saw what Noriko had written. I am still alive. The rest of the page was blank. Mitsuko stared at her own paper. The pencil felt heavy in her hand, like it was made of lead instead of wood. She started to write. Dear Mother. She paused. The next words stuck in her throat. How do you write to a family that believes you died honorably? How do you tell them that you lived and that your survival was made possible by the very men they called barbarians? The shame was not simple. It was layered, folded over itself like origami. It wasn't just surviving. It was surviving like this, being shown mercy by those they were taught to despise. The enemy was supposed to burn villages and violate bodies. Instead, they offered stew and bandages. Instead, they asked, Are you okay? In broken Japanese, their faces flushed with embarrassment at mispronouncing the words. Mitsuko's hand moved across the page. Dear Mother, I am in Texas. They gave me a dress. They gave me bacon. I do not understand it, but I am alive. I will come home when I can. Please wait for me. She didn't sign it. She just folded the paper, creased it carefully, and placed it in the wooden box by the barn door where Caleb had said the letters would be collected. It would be sent or not. That didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had given her a voice, even if no one answered. 3 weeks later, the postal carrier arrived at Camp Livingston with a canvas sack full of mail. Most of it was for the Cowboys' letters from sweethearts and mothers and brothers still overseas. But at the bottom of the sack, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, were 11 letters addressed to the barn. Caleb brought them in personally. He called out names, mangling the pronunciations, but the women didn't care. They rushed forward, hands outstretched, eyes wide. When he called Mitsuko Tanaka, she froze. He held the envelope out to her. Her name was written in her mother's handwriting, the characters shaky but unmistakable. She took it with trembling hands, walked back to her cot and sat down. For a long moment she just held it. Then she opened it. The letter was short. The ink had smudged in places as if her mother had been crying while she wrote. Mitsuko, my beloved daughter, I thought you were dead. I cried every night. Now I know you are alive and I cry from joy. Are you eating enough? Are they hurting you? Please tell me the truth. I will wait for you however long it takes. I will wait. Mitsuko read it 3 times. Then she pressed the letter to her chest, knelt on the floor, and sobbed. Not quietly, not carefully. She cried the way a dam breaks all at once, unstoppable. Chio knelt beside her and wrapped her arms around Mitsuko's shoulders. Fumiko sat on her other side, hand resting gently on her back. Tsuruko, the oldest among them, stroked Mitsuko's hair and whispered, "Your mother is waiting. You have to go back. You have to live." That night, Mitsuko lay awake with the letter tucked under her pillow. She could feel it there, a small square of paper that proved someone somewhere still loved her, still waited for her, still believed she was worth waiting for. It was the first time in 3 years she'd felt like she had a future. The next afternoon, while the sun scorched the dry dirt outside and the barn smelled faintly of cornmeal and hay, Levi brought out an old frayed pack of playing cards. He shuffled them slowly, dramatically, the corners cracking from years of use. The red diamonds had faded to pink. The spades were chipped at the edges. The women watched cautiously, sitting on crates and overturned buckets, their chores done for the day. Levi dealt the cards face down on a wooden table and gestured. At first, no one moved. Then Chio, the former schoolteacher, who learned faster than anyone else, stepped forward and picked up a hand. She stared at the shapes. Hearts, clubs, spades, diamonds. Levi smiled and tapped the cards, saying softly in English, "Poker." The next hour was filled with broken language and exaggerated gestures. They learned the rules not by words but by mimicry, watching, pointing, laughing when someone made the wrong move, not out of cruelty, but out of shared confusion. Chio won the first real hand and slapped her cards down on the table triumphantly. Levi whistled, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small harmonica, battered and dented. He handed it to her like it was a prize at a carnival. She blinked, stunned. Then she cradled it in both hands like something sacred. That night, Chio sat on the steps of the barn, breathing carefully into the harmonica, fumbling her way through a simple, trembling tune. The notes wobbled and cracked, but she kept trying. One woman who hadn't spoken in days, a quiet girl named Midori, began to hum along. The sound rose like a thread of smoke into the dusk, weaving between the chirp of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. For a few moments, the silence between them all turned into something warm. The next day, someone said, "Thank you," in English. Another replied with, "Good," a word they'd heard the Cowboys say often. Then came "okay" and "food," and then, unthinkably, "funny." Levi told a joke, something clumsy and sweet about chickens and fences. Mitsuko didn't understand half the words, but the way he grinned while telling it, the way his hands flapped like wings, made her snort. The sound surprised her so much she covered her mouth with both hands. But the others laughed too. Not at the joke, not really, but at the absurdity of it all. The enemy told a joke, and it was stupid, and it made them laugh. And that somehow was worse than any insult, because laughter meant something had shifted. That night, a group of women sat around a campfire at the edge of the property, invited by the ranch hands who kept watch. There was stew and cornbread beans cooked with bacon fat, and slices of apple that dripped juice down their wrists. One man played a soft tune on a banjo, another taught them the word moon. They pointed at the sky, and the girls whispered it back like a secret. Moon. They said it over and over, testing the shape of it in their mouths. Cultural disarmament came not through orders or treaties, but through these tiny exchanges. Passing a spoon, naming a tree, humming along to a melody no one fully understood. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't even acceptance. It was something more dangerous. It was familiarity. And with it came joy, real joy, fleeting, stolen guilty. The next afternoon, Fumiko, who had never played cards before in her life, bet a ribbon she had hidden in her sleeve and won the hand. She grinned wide and unapologetic before she realized what she was doing. She froze. The laughter died in her throat. She looked around, ashamed. The other women looked down because in that moment joy felt like betrayal. It felt like forgetting. But no one scolded her. And the next day they played again. It was nailed crookedly to the post just outside the mess hall, its frame chipped its glass, dusty with wind-blown grit. No one knew who hung it. Perhaps one of the cooks, perhaps one of the guards. But there it was, a mirror, full-sized and exposed to the rising sun. The first to see it was Tsuruko. She wasn't looking for it. She was just returning a tray, head down, shoulders tight, when she caught the shimmer of light bending back at her in a way she hadn't seen in years. Her eyes lifted slowly, and there it was, her reflection. She froze, not out of vanity, not even shock, but because she hadn't truly seen herself, since before the war began. The face staring back was thinner than she remembered, pale. There was a small scar above her brow she didn't know she had, but the most jarring thing was this: she looked alive. A quiet gasp behind her. Chio had seen it too. She stepped up beside Tsuruko and whispered, "You look clean." It wasn't a compliment, it was a realization, a truth. Within minutes, others joined. A cluster of women stood silently before the mirror like it was a holy object. Some touched their faces, one brushed at a smudge of dirt on her cheek, another tucked loose hair behind her ear. No one spoke loudly. There was reverence in the quiet. Then someone returned with a comb. It began as a ripple. They began brushing their hair, not out of necessity but intention, smoothing strands, separating tangles, rediscovering rituals long buried beneath shame and survival. Ribbons appeared, some homemade, twisted from scrap fabric, some gifted. One girl tied a red piece of cloth around her braid, a gift from the rancher's young daughter, who had slipped it into her hand during chores. Another used twine, another wore wildflowers. They sat in the sunlight, taking turns. One held the comb, while the other sat between her knees. They braided. They giggled softly. They looked at each other not with fear, but with recognition. They were no longer ghosts drifting through a war-torn world. They were girls again, not just alive, but visible. That afternoon they walked beyond the barn fence, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. They crossed into the pasture where the wind smelled of hay and cowhide and distant rain. Their steps were cautious at first, like deer testing uncertain ground, but they kept walking, together, heads high. The cowboys watched from the porch. One raised a hand, another tilted his hat. The women nodded back, not in obedience, but in something closer to acknowledgement. They walked in twos and threes, skirts brushing against tall grass, arms brushing each other. They pointed out birds. They named clouds in Japanese. They smiled without permission. And perhaps most surprising of all, the guards didn't stop them. They weren't trying to escape. They weren't being monitored. They were simply walking. Not as prisoners, not as shameful relics of a lost empire, but as people. When they returned to the barn, the mirror was still there, catching the last light of day. Mitsuko paused before it. She saw the same face, the same eyes, but she also saw something else now. A flicker of softness at the edges, a quiet strength in her spine. She wasn't healed. She might never be, but she was here. She was whole, and she was no longer invisible. But the sky was just as wide and the dust just as thick when Caleb Bridger stood in the barn doorway one evening, hat in hand, and cleared his throat. "Got something to tell you," he said. Dr. Warren stood beside him, translating into slow, careful Japanese. "In 2 weeks, transport will come. You'll be moved to California. From there, some may return to Japan. Some may stay in America, if you have a sponsor." The words landed like stones in still water. Silence. Fumiko's voice, small and trembling, broke it. What if we don't want to leave Texas? Dr. Warren looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the floor, then back up. You can request to stay, Dr. Warren said. But you must have a sponsor, someone who will vouch for you, give you work, a place to live. Caleb shifted his weight. I can talk to people, see who's willing. Mitsuko translated for those who didn't understand English. The barn filled with whispers, some excited, some terrified, some simply numb. That night, no one slept. The next evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to prick through the darkening sky, Levi appeared with an old camera, battered, held together with tape and hope. Can I take a picture? He asked, shy, fumbling with the strap. To remember. The women exchanged glances. Caleb stepped forward. Not for the newspaper, not for anyone else, just for us. So we remember you were here. Mitsuko looked at him. You want to remember us? Yeah, Caleb said quietly. We do. They lined up in front of the barn. 23 women, Caleb, Levi, Dr. Warren, a few other cowboys who had worked the ranchmen whose names the women had learned over weeks of shared meals and quiet mornings. Levi set the timer, fumbled with the settings, and ran into position. Click. The photograph captured them in black and white, slightly overexposed from the setting sun. Mitsuko stood in the center, hands clasped in front of her, the broken bamboo comb tucked into her pocket. Chio stood to her right, harmonica cradled in both hands. Fumiko on her left, wildflowers still woven into her hair. Noriko stood in the back row, one hand resting gently on Tsuruko's shoulder. Caleb stood at the far left, hat in hand. Levi grinned despite himself. Dr. Warren looked tired, but at peace. No one smiled, but every face held something softer than fear. Something that looked, if you squinted just right, like hope. The next morning, Fumiko stood in the center of the barn and made an announcement. I want to stay, she said, in Texas. Mitsuko turned. But your family? I have no family, Fumiko interrupted. Her voice was steady. I am an orphan. I was taken from a children's home when I was 16. There is no one waiting for me in Japan. She looked around the barn at the faces of the women who had become her sisters, at the cots they had slept on, at the mirror that had shown them they were still human. Here, she said, I have you, I have the Cowboys, I have a home. Caleb, standing near the door, nodded. I can sponsor you. You can work on the ranch, learn English. You'll be safe. Fumiko's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. By the end of the day, 3 other women had made the same choice. 4 would stay. 19 would return to Japan. The barn divided quietly into 2 groups. Not enemies, just women on different paths. Those who stayed hugged those who were leaving. Those who were leaving whispered promises to write, to remember, to never forget the barn in Texas where the enemy had handed them dresses. The final night came too quickly. They gathered around the largest fire they'd ever been allowed. Levi played his banjo. Chio accompanied him on the harmonica, her fingers more confident now, the notes clearer. Fumiko sang a lullaby from Hokkaido, her voice strong and unashamed. The Cowboys sang along, not knowing the words, just humming the melody, their deep voices blending with the higher tones of the women. Then Mitsuko stood. She walked to the center of the circle, and without a word, she began to dance. It was a traditional Japanese dance, one her mother had taught her when she was a child. Slow, graceful. Each movement deliberate, each gesture weighted with meaning. Her arms flowed like water. Her feet barely touched the ground. Everyone went silent. The firelight flickered across her face. The stars wheeled overhead. And for 3 minutes, there was no war, no shame, no enemies. Just a girl dancing under a Texas sky, remembering who she used to be. When she finished, she bowed deeply. The silence held for 1 breath, 2. Then everyone applauded, cowboys and prisoners alike. hands clapping together in a rhythm that sounded for just a moment like unity. Mitsuko lifted her head, and for the first time in 3 years, she smiled, a real smile, wide and unguarded, and full of something that felt dangerously close to joy. Caleb Bridger, standing at the edge of the fire, watched her and thought of his brother Daniel. He thought of the letter still folded in his pocket. I killed 3 men today. I don't feel proud. I just feel tired. He whispered into the night, too soft for anyone to hear. I know, brother. I know. The fire burned low. The stars turned overhead, and in the barn behind them 19 women packed their few belongings, preparing to leave the only place in 3 years where they had been treated like human beings. They didn't know what waited for them in California. They didn't know if Japan would welcome them back or turn them away. They didn't know if their families would understand. But they knew this. Once in a barn in Texas, the enemy had handed them dresses, and that memory, more than anything the propaganda had ever told them, would follow them for the rest of their lives. The trucks arrived just after sunrise. Not military convoys this time, just covered transports meant for relocation, their engines rumbling low and steady in the cool morning air. The sky was pale gold, streaked with thin clouds that stretched across the horizon like brushstrokes. 19 women stood beside the barn, each holding a small cloth bundle. Everything they owned fit in their arms. A dress, a comb, a bar of soap, letters from home folded and refolded until the creases had worn thin. For some, a photograph. For others, a memory of bacon that would never quite fade. Mitsuko stood at the front, the broken bamboo comb in her pocket, her mother's letter tucked inside her dress, close to her heart. She looked at the barn one last time. The crooked mirror still hung by the mess hall. The fire pit where they had danced was now just a circle of ash and stones. The pasture stretched wide and empty grass, swaying in the wind. 4 women stood apart from the group. Fumiko, 2 others whose names were Aiko and Sumiko, and Tsuruko, who had decided at the last moment that she could not return to a country that held only ghosts. Fumiko's face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. Mitsuko walked to her, and they stood for a moment, forehead to forehead, hands clasped. "Live well," Mitsuko whispered. "Come back someday," Fumiko whispered back. "I will." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it was the kind of lie that felt like hope. Caleb Bridger stood beside the truck, hat in hand, his face weathered and tired. He had barely slept. He watched as the women climbed into the back of the transport one by one, their movements slow and careful, like they were stepping into a river and didn't know how deep it went. When Mitsuko reached the truck, she paused. She turned back to Caleb, and for a moment they just looked at each other. 2 people on opposite sides of a war that had ended months ago, but still lived in their bones. "Thank you," she said in English. The words were clumsy, but they were hers. Caleb nodded. "You take care of yourself, Mom." She climbed into the truck. The canvas cover blocked out the sun, and the interior smelled like oil and dust and something faintly metallic. The women sat on wooden benches that ran along both sides, facing each other. No one spoke. The engine growled to life. The truck lurched forward. Mitsuko pressed her hand against the canvas and looked back through the gap. She saw Fumiko standing beside Caleb, waving. She saw the barn growing smaller. She saw the pasture, the fence, the cowboys standing in a loose line, hats in their hands. Then the truck turned onto the main road, and it was all gone. She sat back and closed her eyes. Beside her, Chio was clutching her harmonica so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. Noriko stared at the floor, lips moving silently like she was counting something only she could see. The road stretched long and straight ahead of them, leading somewhere they couldn't yet name. 1 week after Mitsuko left, Howard Duncan returned to the ranch. He came alone this time. No angry mob, no shouting, just an old man in a worn truck, dust trailing behind him like a shadow. He knocked on the door of the main house. Caleb answered. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Duncan removed his hat. "I came to apologize," he said. His voice was rough, scraped, raw. "To you and to them. But I hear they're gone." "Most of 'em," Caleb said. "4 stayed." Duncan nodded slowly. He looked older than he had a month ago. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His shoulders sagged under the weight of something he couldn't name. "I lost my son," Duncan said. "Henry. He was 19. He liked fishing. Wrote me every week." He paused. "I needed someone to blame. And they were easy to blame." Caleb said nothing. "I'm sorry," Duncan said again. "I was wrong." Caleb studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the kitchen. "Fumiko works there now. Makes coffee. You want a cup?" Duncan hesitated, then nodded. 2 days later, Duncan came back. He didn't say much, just sat at the counter, drank his coffee, and left a $1 tip beside the empty cup. Fumiko stared at it for a long time after he left, not sure what it meant. But he came back again the next week, and the week after that. And slowly, without words, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but the beginning of it. The acknowledgement that grief didn't have to harden into hate. Over the years, the letters came and went like tides. 1946. Mitsuko wrote from Tokyo, "I am teaching English now. The children ask me where I learned. I tell them I had a good teacher, a cowboy who said ma'am." 1947. Caleb wrote back, "Fumiko got married. Local farmer named Earl, good man, quiet. She still hums that song you all used to sing, makes me think of you." 1948. Mitsuko wrote, "My mother passed away last month. Pneumonia. I was with her at the end. She asked if I was happy. I told her yes. I think I meant it." 1949. Caleb wrote, "Levi died. Heart attack. He was only 34. We buried him under the oak tree by the east pasture. I put his harmonica in the grave. Thought he'd want it." 1950. Mitsuko wrote, "I have a daughter now. Her name is Hanako. She is 7 years old and asks too many questions. She wants to know about the war. I don't know how to tell her. How do you explain kindness from the enemy? How do you explain bacon?" 1951. Caleb wrote, "I'm getting old. My hands shake when I write. But I wanted you to know, Fumiko has 2 children now, a boy and a girl. The boy's name is Daniel after my brother. She asked if that was okay. I cried." 1952. Mitsuko wrote, "Chio passed away, cancer. Her daughter sent me her harmonica. I keep it on my desk. Sometimes I try to play it, but I was never as good as she was. I cried when I heard the news, not because she died, but because she lived. She got to live." 1980. Fumiko wrote to Mitsuko, "Noriko came to visit last month. She traveled all the way from Osaka. She works at a veterans hospital now, caring for soldiers who came home broken. She told me she thinks of us every time she wraps a bandage. She said that cowboy medic taught her how to touch someone without hurting them. She's never forgotten." 1983. Mitsuko wrote back, "I received a letter from Tsuruko's son. She passed away in her sleep 2 weeks ago. She was 66. He said she kept the wildflowers pressed in a book until the day she died. She told him once, 'I walked free in Texas. I want to be buried knowing I walked free.'" 1987. Fumiko wrote, "Aiko and Sumiko are still here. Aiko runs a small restaurant in town. She makes the best cornbread you ever tasted. Sumiko married a ranch hand and has 3 boys. We see each other every Sunday. We're old now, but we still remember. We'll always remember." The letters stopped for a while after that. Life moved forward as it always does, carrying people with it whether they were ready or not. Then, in 1985, a package arrived at Mitsuko's apartment in Tokyo. She was 60 years old now. Her hair had gone grey. She wore reading glasses that slipped down her nose when she graded papers. She taught English at a high school near the center of the city, and her students loved her because she never raised her voice, never lost her patience, and always said, "Please," and "Thank you." The package was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The return address was from Texas. She opened it slowly, carefully, the way you open something you know will hurt. Inside was the photograph from 1945, the one Levi had taken in front of the barn. It had been framed in simple wood, the glass clean, the image preserved, and tucked into the frame was a letter. "Dear Mitsuko," it began, "I am 72 years old now. My hands shake. My eyes are going. But I wanted you to have this before I forget how to write. Levi took this picture 40 years ago. He always said you all were the bravest people he ever met. I didn't understand what he meant then. I think I do now. Fumiko is doing well. She has 4 grandchildren. She still makes bacon every morning, and every morning she cries a little. I asked her why once. She said, because someone was kind when they didn't have to be. I think about that a lot. I think about all of you. I hope you're well. I hope you found peace. Your friend, Caleb Bridger." Mitsuko read the letter 3 times. Then she hung the photograph on the wall of her classroom right beside the chalkboard where her students could see it every day. When they asked, "Sensei, who are they?" she would pause, look at the faces frozen in black and white and say, "People who taught me that even enemies can be kind." 10 years later, in 1995, the Texas Historical Museum opened a new exhibit. It was small, tucked in a corner of the second floor, but it was carefully curated. The walls were painted soft grey. The lights were dim, respectful like the lighting in a chapel. The centerpiece was the photograph from 1945 blown up to 4 feet wide, mounted on the wall in a thick wooden frame. Beside it, displayed in glass cases, were the artifacts. Chio's harmonica dented and tarnished, resting on a bed of dark velvet. Mitsuko's broken bamboo comb, the 2 pieces placed side by side. A letter written in shaky handwriting, just 4 words, "I am still alive," signed by Noriko. Beside the letter, a small placard read, "Noriko Yamamoto, 1923 to 1992. After returning to Japan, she became a nurse at Osaka Veterans Hospital, where she cared for wounded soldiers for 47 years. In her final interview before her death, she said, "I learned in Texas that healing begins with gentleness. I wanted every patient to feel what I felt when that American doctor wrapped my wounds, seen, safe, human." A cotton dress, faded blue with white flowers preserved behind glass like a religious relic. A strip of bacon sculpted in bronze mounted on a small pedestal with a placard that read, "The meal that changed everything." The curator was a woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed and efficient. She stood beside the exhibit during the opening, answering questions from visitors, most of them older men in veterans' caps, their wives beside them holding their arms. 23 women arrived at Camp Livingston in October 1945, the curator explained. They had been classified as comfort unit personnel by the Japanese military, non-combatants, victims. The cowboys who ran the camp treated them with dignity, fed them, clothed them, protected them. 4 stayed in America, 19 returned to Japan. All of them lived full lives. This is their story. One visitor, a man in his 80s with a Marine Corps cap and a cane, stood in front of the photograph for a long time. His wife touched his arm gently. "You okay, honey?" she asked. He nodded, but his eyes were wet. "I was at Iwo," he said quietly. "I killed men who looked like them. Boys, really. Just boys." He paused. "I'm glad someone was kind." On the day of the museum's grand opening, an elderly woman was wheeled through the doors by her daughter. Mitsuko Tanaka was 70 years old now, frail, her body worn by time and illness. But her eyes were still sharp, still clear. Her daughter, Hanako, had brought her all the way from Tokyo for this. It had taken months of planning, doctor's appointments, visa applications. Mitsuko had come from Tokyo for this. It had taken months of planning doctor's appointments, visa applications. She was frail now, her body worn by time and illness, but her eyes were still sharp, still clear. Hanako wheeled her mother through the exhibit, slowly pausing at each display. When they reached the photograph, Mitsuko leaned forward, squinting. "There," she whispered, pointing at the center of the image. "That's me." Hanako looked. She saw a young woman, thin and tired, but standing upright, dignified, alive. "You were beautiful, Mama," Hanako said. Mitsuko shook her head. "I was broken. You survived." "Yes," Mitsuko said softly. "I survived." Then she saw him. An old man, 82 years old, leaning on a cane, standing in front of the photograph. He wore a cowboy hat, battered and stained, and a shirt with pearl buttons. His face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of sun and wind, but his eyes, pale blue, were the same. "Caleb?" Mitsuko's voice was barely a whisper. The old man turned. For a moment he didn't recognize her. Then his eyes widened. "Mitsuko." She nodded, tears already streaming down her face. He walked toward her, slow and unsteady, and knelt beside the wheelchair. They looked at each other for a long moment, two people who had survived a war and lived long enough to meet again on the other side of it. Then Caleb reached into his jacket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He unfolded it carefully, and inside was the broken bamboo comb. The real one, not the one in the museum, the one Mitsuko had left behind 40 years ago. "You dropped this," he said, his voice rough with age and emotion. "Thought you might want it back." Mitsuko took the comb in trembling hands. She held it to her chest and wept. They stayed like that for a long time. An old cowboy and an old woman. Two survivors, two witnesses, two people who had learned that kindness could outlast hate. Later that day, Mitsuko was recorded for the museum's oral history project. She sat in a chair in front of a camera, her daughter beside her, and spoke in clear, deliberate English. "People ask me, 'Did you forgive the war?' she said. I tell them I do not forgive war. War cannot be forgiven. But I forgive people. The Cowboys did not start the war. We did not start the war. We were caught in it. And in that barn in Texas, we learned something important. Kindness is not weakness. Mercy is not betrayal. Sometimes the enemy is just another person who is also afraid." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I am 70 years old. My mother died in 1960. My daughter is a doctor. My grandson is in university. He asks me about the war. I show him the photograph. I tell him, even in the darkest night, someone might hand you a dress. Hold on to that, remember that, because that is how we survive. Not by hate, but by remembering we are all human." The camera kept rolling as she wiped her eyes. "I will die soon," she said. "I know this. But before I die, I want to say thank you to Caleb, to Levi, to Dr. Warren, to all the cowboys who saw us not as enemies, but as people. Thank you for the dresses. Thank you for the bacon. Thank you for letting us be human again." She looked directly into the camera. If you are watching this, and you are angry and you want to hate someone because of where they were born or what they look like, I ask you to remember, we were the enemy, and they gave us bacon. They gave us kindness. And that changed everything. The recording ended. 6 months later, at another exhibit opening, a second oral history was recorded. This time, the subject was Fumiko. She was 69 years old, still living on the ranch in Texas. Her hair was white. Her hands were spotted with age, but her smile was the same. "I stayed because I had no home in Japan," she said. "But here Caleb gave me a home. I married a farmer. We had 2 children. Now I have 4 grandchildren." She paused, looking down at her hands. "Every morning I make bacon," she said. "Same recipe Levi taught me. My grandchildren ask, 'Grandma, why do you cry when you cook bacon?' I tell them, Because someone was kind when they didn't have to be. Her voice broke. I cry because I remember. I remember what it felt like to be hated, and I remember what it felt like when that hate stopped, when someone looked at me and saw a person, not a Jap, not an enemy, just a girl who was tired and scared and hungry. She looked into the camera. "Kindness saved my life," she said. "I want people to know that. I want them to remember. Hate is easy. Kindness is hard. But kindness is what survives." The years passed. 2001. Caleb Bridger died at the age of 88. Heart failure. He died in his sleep in the same house where he'd lived his entire life. Fumiko was at his funeral. She brought bacon wrapped in wax paper and left it on his grave. 2002. Mitsuko Tanaka died at the age of 80. Pneumonia. Her daughter was with her at the end. Her last words, whispered in Japanese, then translated into English, were, "Tell the Cowboys, thank you." Her daughter had those words engraved on her headstone. 2010. The museum expanded the exhibit. More photographs, more letters, more artifacts. It became one of the most visited exhibits in the building, especially among veterans and their families. 2011. Fumiko's granddaughter, a college student studying history, wrote her thesis on Camp Livingston. She interviewed 12 surviving family members of the women who had been held there. She found letters, she found diaries, she found recipes for bacon written in shaky English on the backs of envelopes. 2012. The photograph from 1945 was digitized and shared online. It went viral. Millions of people saw it. They read the story. They cried. They shared it with their children and grandchildren. And in the comments in dozens of languages, people wrote the same thing over and over. Never forget. This is how we survive. Kindness matters. The barn in Texas is gone now. It burned down in 2003, struck by lightning during a summer storm. But the land is still there. The pasture, where 19 women walked freely for the first time in years. The fence where Caleb stood and watched them go. The fire pit where Mitsuko danced under the stars. There's a marker there now, a simple stone plaque that reads, "In memory of the 23 women of Camp Livingston, Texas, October 1945. And the cowboys who saw them not as enemies but as people. 4 stayed. 19 returned home. All lived full lives. May we remember their story. May we choose kindness." And every year on the anniversary of that October morning, when the trucks arrived and the women were handed dresses instead of shame, someone leaves a strip of bacon on the stone. No one knows who does it, but it's always there. A reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, when hate seems inevitable and cruelty seems easier, there is always a choice. The choice to see the enemy as human, the choice to offer a dress instead of a chain, the choice to cook bacon for someone who was taught you would kill them. That choice, more than any battle, more than any treaty, more than any victory or defeat, is what survives. That is the legacy, not of war, but of the people who refused to let war make them cruel. The photograph remains, black and white, slightly overexposed. 23 women and 3 cowboys standing in front of a barn that no longer exists, in a moment that should have been filled with hate, but was filled with something else instead. Hope, fragile, uncertain, but real. And in the center of the photograph, standing with her hands clasped, a broken comb in her pocket, and a future she couldn't yet imagine, is Mitsuko Tanaka, 20 years old, alive, human. Proof that kindness, even from the enemy, can change everything.